So really today's session is about a discussion. It's really a facilitated discussion. We hope that we're going to have some tangible takeaways for you from this discussion. But what we really would like to do is first start off with a little bit of self-reflection, and then open it up into a larger discussion where we can all share sort of our experiences, and we can also learn from one another. And then lastly, to kind of crowdsource some tangible things that we can all be doing to become more anti-racist. And I will say that this is a lifelong journey. None of us are experts in this area. We're all in different points of our journey in terms of our understanding. And really, the more that we come together and learn from one another, the better that we're all will be in sort of this journey. And so that's what I wanted to say to kind of begin. Dr. Walker, I don't know if you wanted to say anything as well, just in terms of a welcome, before we kind of do our next step, which is establishing ground rules for the discussion today.
So I'm so excited that you guys are joining us today. I will say that this space is for you guys to ask any questions that you want. And this is a space that there are no wrong questions, statements. It's a no judgment zone and a safe space. So just keep that in mind. I've had similar conversations with some attendings in my residency program who were on sessions like this and who felt that they didn't want to say anything in sessions like this because it was the wrong thing to say. So I would encourage you guys to, sorry, we're just here to have good conversations today.
Okay, so what we'd like to do is anytime that we're sort of entering this space and this topic, it's always a nice idea for us as a group to establish some ground rules for the discussion. And so feel free to unmute yourself and give a suggestion of a ground rule just as we go through this discussion together. Or you can also use the chat functionality and enter in some of your thoughts about rules that would be helpful to help facilitate that safe space that Dr. Walker was referring to. Any thoughts?
I think Esther is trying to talk, but I can't hear her, but I guess while she's working.
Oh, Esther, were you muted? Oh, no, you're muted now. Now you're not muted, but we still can't hear you.
You might have to unplug your headphones.
Maybe your headphones aren't functioning well.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'll take my headphones away. Thank you. Hi, I'm Esther. I'm zooming in from Michigan. I go to Michigan State. I guess one of the rules that I would like just to be open-minded and be able to like not judge people from their experiences because everybody has different experiences and those are all valid no matter what they are.
Tessa, I'd like to add one. Don't be afraid. We understand that this is all part, you're entering interview season and the last 3 hours were spent talking to residency programs, and there's naturally going to be a little bit of pressure around that about, are we sitting here to evaluate you? The answer is absolutely not. We want this to be an open discussion. This really is for the group. And so as the program director here, I want to say, feel free to be yourself.
Abigail?
Thanks. My name is Abigail Ayong. I'm a MS4 from the University of Arizona in Tucson. So I guess one ground rule I think that would be beneficial for this discussion is to allow someone to complete their train of thought before interjecting or responding to someone's question.
Hi everyone. I'll go next if no one wants to go, or is anyone online? Okay. Hi, my name is Mahima, and I am a student from Michigan State as well. And I think something that I'd like to point is that let's challenge the idea and not attack the individual, because sometimes, you know, we could hear some thoughts and opinions that might kind of fire us up, but it's okay. We're here to have discussion and really, you know, learn from each other and kind of acknowledge the biases we might have, but kind of like, you know, recognizing that and then putting the work forward.
Great. These are all really great points. I'll just share a quick slide of some ground rules that have come up in previous sessions for everyone to just kind of take a look at. And in addition to the wonderful suggestions from the group, if we can kind of agree that that list looks like it would be a fair list to kind of proceed with, we can all sort of start off the discussion sort of in agreement. One moment as I share my screen. I don't know why it's giving me the presenter view, but you can't see it?
We see the first slide.
Okay. I think I know what happened. Okay. Let's try this one. Okay. So everyone just take a moment and kind of look at the statements on this slide in terms of the ground rules, and then we'll come back and everyone can just kind of thumbs up or give their assent in the chat box, and we'll continue. Okay, so hopefully everyone's seen that. And okay, I'm seeing lots of assent in the chat box over here, which is great. And if there's anything else to add on there, please feel free to also add that into the chat box. We can add that in. So the first thing that we'd actually like everyone to do is just a little bit of self-reflection before we kind of enter a space where we're doing some sharing. So given sort of all of the events that have transpired in the last several weeks and sort of the historical context of the last several centuries, just thinking about sort of what has your experience been in terms of intersecting with this work and with what's going on in this country regarding racial injustice and social oppression. Have you been learning lots of new things over the last several weeks? Are you doing some self-exploration? What sort of feelings and emotions have sort of come to the surface for you recently? And just kind of take a moment and just to think about that, because I think it's really important sometimes to have that moment of self-reflection before entering in a space of sharing. So just gonna give everybody a couple of minutes to think about that. If you would like, you can write down your thoughts just to yourself. This is not necessarily meant to be shared, but if you feel that you do want to share and you want to put something in the chat box about how you're feeling, you can also do that. So we'll just take a couple of moments. So thank you everyone for taking a little bit of time for that self-reflection. You know, it's been a very emotional several weeks for me, speaking personally, and I think taking that time to kind of take stock of kind of my own headspace and what I'm feeling has been very important for me during this time. So thank you all for taking the time to do that as well. We're going to open up the discussion a little bit more for really some sharing. We have some prompts that we have developed for potential discussion as well, and we certainly want this to be an open forum. So if other people have particular experiences that they want to share, questions that they want to ask, this is a free space to do that as well. But I will throw it over to my co-host, Dr. Walker, to lead us into that sort of group discussion space.
And also, if you guys have questions that you don't want to say, feel free to write those questions in the chat as well. One of the things that we have kind of been, thinking about is that there were similar events that had been happening in the country for a while now. So I'm just kind of interested from the group, why do you guys think that the recent events have gained national attention now and not necessarily before?
I feel like in today's age, sorry, can I go ahead? Okay. Yeah, I feel like in today's age, like media has a lot to do, a lot of big influence in ways, it can, I guess, like relay information messages. And I feel like, the communities that have been impacted for generations kind of know that these stuff happens behind the closed doors. But I feel like until the camera came through, the video, the pictures, and that's when I feel like it triggered to the communities that were being impacted, but also like gave a picture to those, who are not necessarily belonging to the community, to the community of color, kind of saw like what happens behind closed doors. And that kind of did some kind of awakening in terms of, your moral responsibility as a human being, like what was being done and what was unjust and, what needs to happen. And it's sad that it always happens at the expense of some life, but I feel like, the big movement kind of happened because of the media this time versus, Black and brown communities knows that Black lives have always mattered. It should not matter now. Moving forward, it should just matter, period, just like every single, living being on this planet. And I feel like it's the media that kind of held people accountable, to speak up about their experiences, to kind of acknowledge the biases that they might have, and what could have perpetuated such a horrendous act by like people who should have protected this nation and the community. And I think it's the media that did the job, and it's sad that it took the media to do it, not the people who have always been screaming, hey, I exist, like I matter, like listen to me. So I think it's that.
I think, oh, sorry.
I just absolutely, yeah.
Echoing what Mahima is saying about the media, I actually think that because of the media going back to 2014, 2012, their coverage of it, it's an exhaustive news cycle, right? Things come into our heads very briefly and then it goes because something else comes. And I think with the recent events of 2020, jumping 6 years in between, people are like, wait, this is still happening? So I think for those who it doesn't directly affect, it brought it back to their attention and awareness. And the difference this time around is that you see a lot more allies. And I think that is speaking volumes because now more people are recognizing this than just those who have been directly affected. And I think that's very powerful. Again, Mahima saying about the media, I think that because they put this so much ahead of like all the other news items, it's just repetitive. Here it is. I think that is what's sticking to like the generations that are now speaking up for it.
Hello, I'm Haneen. I'm a fourth year at Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. And I absolutely agree with both Mahima and Annie. The media and the repetition in the media, and also Annie brought up a good point. It's the generation now that we are in, and younger generations. And we all know that we've grown up with these people. We've grown up and been able to get to know each other despite our differences, despite our similarities, and how we come from different races and backgrounds and cultures. And I think the most recent events and how it's become so dominant and so important in recent months is because it's led by younger generations, honestly. So, yeah.
Also, just another thing to add, I'm Como. I'm here in the city, but I'm also from St. Louis, Missouri, where Michael Ferguson, where the protests were all happening there in 2014. And I think a big difference between back then and now is also the context we're in is in a pandemic, which are affecting communities of color even more. So I think that's definitely important to keep in our minds. And while we're already seeing disparities, and then this is just another one being shown, it's definitely like I think affected us in the medical community, and we feel the need to show up even now more than ever, just seeing the effects that a pandemic can have on communities of color while they're already suffering police brutality. So I think that's really on all of us to show up, and it's kind of disappointing that some of us did not feel the need to do that before, but I think after seeing these disparities so frankly pointed out during this pandemic is frightening, and I don't think any of us want to just be bystanders anymore.
Those are all really great points, and I think some really thoughtful insights of looking at sort of the conditions that brought about sort of this tipping point, if you will, in terms of the longstanding police brutality that has existed, and then the many ways that communities of color have experienced oppression and inequities in this country for a long time.
I've been assigned to monitor the chat, so I'm going to read one that came in just to add context. This individual says, I think a few things are at play. The volume of videos that have come out certainly provide a preponderance of the evidence for people to start to realize how prevalent police violence is. But I also think that people who were previously, quote unquote, asleep because their lives were well insulated are now more vigilant because of the erosion of human rights under this administration. The pandemic also shocked people out of their comfortable bubbles, at least early on, because there was a recognition of each life being precarious. But finally, I think the deliberate and slow way that George Floyd was murdered laid bare the false arguments that it's about police acting out of fear.
Absolutely, I agree with all of those statements. I think it's interesting how media definitely plays a role in our awareness of a lot of these things. If you think back to like the 1960s civil rights movement, the rest of the country was aware because a lot of the images were broadcasted on national television during that time, which enraged people and garnered national support for the movement because of media. So definitely a really good point as well. And then I know a lot of people I've talked to because of COVID, since they were at home, they had a lot more time also to kind of watch television and get involved in ways that they may not have been able to before. So that's also a very good point as well. Was there any other comments or things that you guys can think of?
I think talking about Adrienne's response about the insulated folks, I've had a couple of conversations myself with people who question about the legitimacy of police brutality and the inequitable differences. And I think that those who are asleep, it's interesting to have people sort of, I don't say infiltrate, but like be part of that discourse to explain, you know what, like, here's the statistics. And I think it's an interesting perspective as those in medicine, as those who understand research statistics, how we can be part of that change. And if we are part of some of those circles who do question what the social context is right now, then we have that tool belt to say, hey, these are the statistics straight from the CDC, straight from the FBI.gov website, like, here's what's happening. So I think that's an interesting point when Adrienne talks about the insulation and the bubble of those folks.
Absolutely. And so another thing we would like to talk about is just kind of talking about people's experiences of witnessing microaggressions or having experienced them themselves. One of the definitions of microaggressions, it actually comes from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is that microaggression is a comment or an attitude that is often unconsciously or unintentionally expressed as a prejudiced attitude towards a member of a marginalized group. And also sometimes behavior or speech that's also kind of characterized by such comments or actions that that can make someone feel that they are experiencing kind of biased attitudes. So has anyone experienced this for themselves or have witnessed this?
And feel free as well to, if you want in the chat, if you have like some examples of just ones that kind of come to mind, either that you've experienced or witnessed, or that you kind of know just from maybe intersecting with this work before, of what some examples are. Because I think that it's really important for us to have some tangible things to really talk about this. And we received some questions in advance of this session, and one of the students asked us about this, particularly in the medical school setting. And as many of you are medical students, thinking about sort of how you may have experienced or seen microaggressions in the clinical setting, and how we kind of navigate that, particularly when there is that sort of power differential that comes from being a medical student on a team. So if anybody wants to toss out ideas, use the chat as well if things come to mind. We're really just kind of learning from each other and through our own experiences.
I have an example that I can give. So when I was in a clinical setting, I was the only person of color there, and I think I take big pride in where I come from. And I'm originally from Nepal, immigrated to the United States about 14 years ago. And that's who I am. And so I feel like wherever I go, I kind of share a piece of my identity with people, and let them know, where I come from and what my story is, and connect with people. But in this clinical setting, every time when I would speak, they would make me repeat as if, they didn't understand like what I was speaking, because they told me that I have a little bit of an accent, and I think I take a big pride in that accent because that is, what I have remaining from my home country, and that is something that still remains with me, despite the fact that a lot of stuff that I don't get hold of. And that was one of the examples that happened. And the other examples were also like, they would never introduce me as a medical student, despite the fact that I had a white coat that says medical student from certain institution, you know, like I'm right there in front of their face, you know, trying to be as polite as I can, and they would just be like a volunteer, MA, but never like a medical, you know, assistant. And then one time when I, you know, clarified to them that, hey, like I am a medical student. Hi, my name is Mahima and I'm a medical student. How can I help you? And they were basically like, oh, wait, you're a nursing student? And then I was like, no, like, you know, and then I kind of was also like, well, a lot of people are confused because they're from like a different, you know, depending on people's educational level, like there is a lot of confusion as to roles in medicine. And so I was like, well, maybe, you know, this could be like that one incident where that happened. Let me educate them. They're like, no, there's, you know, medical school and there's like PA school and, you know, there's a nursing school. There's also nurse practitioner school. And despite the fact that I explained to them every time, like they would always address me as something else other than like medical student. And so that was kind of a little bit of tiring, you know, especially when not a lot of like people from my side of the world like make it to medical school or show up in these spaces. And I take big pride in that. And that's the reason why I'm here. But at the same time, I feel like these comments kind of take away a little bit of the reasons that I am in medicine for. It's a little disheartening, but you know, I'm here so that we can have these kind of debate and hopefully change the environment, the climate that we live in.
Thank you for sharing.
I have an example of both in and outside of medicine. Growing up in a predominantly Caucasian community and being only one of a few of the minority students, I had a friend who had just immigrated from the Philippines, and we both speak Tagalog, and so we would communicate in language they were comfortable in. And I remember a couple times when classmates would be like, stop talking in your language, it sounds funny, like speak English, you're in America. So I've had that in like certain contexts, and I guess in a similar fashion in medicine, like I feel like sometimes obviously we're busy, and you know, sometimes it's easier just to try to speak to someone in English than it is to, you know, try to get an interpreter, get a, you know, like one of those visual translator machines. And so there have definitely been times where I've had experiences with attendings and residents where, you know, someone was coming in, obviously Spanish is a big language in Arizona, and, you know, some people know and can get by with some English, but majority of them prefer Spanish. But sometimes people just dismiss them like, oh, they can understand, or like, oh, they'll figure it out. Like, we'll just kind of get it done. We have to go back upstairs to round or something. And then I remember another time where we had a patient who needed to be consented for an LP, and we needed this interpreter come on, but because of the delay, it was taking a while before we could even get started. And you could definitely tell you could have the feeling in the room was very apparent on how the resident felt about the situation. And then I guess this is kind of more related to outside of the language context, a little bit kind of echoing what Mahima mentioned in regards to like being a female in medicine. And obviously that's kind of been prominent with some of the studies that have come out. If you're on social media and you know like a couple of the papers that came out, I've definitely had times where I and another med student who was male were in the same room, and instead of being addressed, they would always look at the male student. They would pretty much dismiss me completely, even if I spoke about something, and they would just kind of target all the conversations and all the next steps in care or planning management to my male colleague, whether it be a patient or an attending. And it luckily hasn't happened every time, but there have definitely been instances where it's happened to me.
Tessa and Jaquay, there's actually several coming in through the
Yes,
chat box that I'd be happy to read. The first one says, I was called girl student for all of my surgery rotation. Then my evaluation said I was shy. Being shy is fine, but I'm not. I was just astounded and mute the entire time as a result. The next one says, this patient interaction is going to sound like a scene out of Grey's Anatomy, but during the first rotation of my third year, Myself and the fellow classmate went in to interview a patient who had a very apparent swastika tattoo, and he wouldn't acknowledge me at all. Another one says, a Latina colleague yesterday was telling me about how frequently patients ask her to clear their food. Another one says, yes, I used to work in a retirement home as a personal support worker, and I was one of the few Caucasians working there. Several patients told me they were so happy I was helping them because I was white. I told them my coworkers were just as qualified and kind as I was. I feel I could have said more though, and hope to become a better advocate for my colleagues who are minorities. And then the last one says, actually, I'm going to have to reread the last one before I clarify it. I want to clarify what the asterisk in there means, but I'll throw it back out to the group while I figure out this next one.
No, thank you. Thank you everyone for sharing. It's always disheartening in a way to see how many examples people can come up with in a really short period of time. And it seems like once you start thinking of one and somebody else shares another, you remember like, oh, I've experienced that too, or something similar has happened to somebody I know. And you know, the term microaggression is a little bit misleading because there's nothing small about the impact of these words and of the behavior. And it takes a toll. And I think the best way that I've heard it described is thinking about sort of like a mosquito bite. And if you get like one mosquito bite, it's annoying and you kind of scratch it and you wish it wouldn't have happened, but you move forward. But when you're attacked by multiple mosquitoes every single day over and over and over again, like it's overwhelming. Like you feel miserable. It takes over. And I think that, you know, it's really important for us to think about, you know, racism as sort of this spectrum, and microaggressions are part of that, right? And that is one of the manifestations. And so it's not always what's necessarily shown as the shocking thing in a recorded video, but it is these everyday experiences that people have day in and day out as well.
Just adding one more in here from the chat. I realized what this one said that I kind of stumbled over it. It was Kamal just correcting when she said Michael Ferguson. She meant to say Michael Brown from Ferguson. So I apologize. I was reading another example. The next one here says, number one, seeing Black patients often treated dismissively when they are admitted with complications from chronic conditions, especially if they were quote unquote frequent flyers. Number two, a nurse spent an entire case in the operating room fuming about being corrected in her pronunciation of the patient's name by his mother, whom she clearly felt was less educated. Thankfully, the patient, a Black toddler, was under anesthesia, but I could only despair thinking of how this racism was already starting in his young life. And number three, being told I'm quote unquote motherly toward my patients, not compassionate, not a good advocate. And then there's a comment that says maybe micro describes the amount of effort or thought the speaker had to expend to show that aggression.
That's well put. That's well put. So given that these are such pervasive experiences, how have people sort of in this group addressed these microaggressions, or maybe not addressed these microaggressions? Like, are there things that you have said or done at the time, or things that you have said or done afterwards? Are there oftentimes things that you don't try to address in the moment or at all for one reason or another? Because I think that we can all learn from one another in terms of just our own ways of addressing microaggressions and the toll that sometimes it takes in having to address this as well.
I think as some of my colleagues have mentioned, a lot of things have happened in the clinic. For me, when I get microaggressions about either being a female or being Asian American, and then just talking, for some reason, extrapolating to talking about the Vietnam War, sometimes it can get a little bit aggressive, but the preceptor hasn't always stepped in to, I don't want to say protect me, because maybe this is also a situation where I should protect myself. But sometimes as a med student, you sort of feel like this is not your situation to control. And that's probably where I need to get better at. But I sort of wish I've had more preceptors sort of lay down the law to the patient, be like, hey, Mr. John, that's not okay to say to my medical student. That would have been very nice.
I've actually, there was a comment by Adrienne about seeing Black patients often treated dismissively when they're admitted for chronic conditions, and it just brought me to an experience I had in my internal medicine rotation where this patient who had sickle cell, he had a crisis, and it was interesting to see like the nursing staff and sort of even the residents that clearly knew him and kind of like didn't want to deal with him because like they want to just shove him in a room and give him pain medications and just like be done with him. And then when I went to meet the patient and talk to him, and I just got a completely different like understanding about his situation and how he deals with this chronic condition. And I feel like that could have been an opportunity for me to like talk to the resident and kind of like get some idea of like why that's like their perspective on it. But I guess because of the, I don't know if it was a power differential or whatever, but I just didn't feel like it was my place to like combat that perspective, I guess, as a medical student. So I guess I need to figure out ways to better address like situations like that where I feel like I do have the opportunity to step in and talk, but I just don't know how to go about doing that.
I definitely think that a big, I guess, issue, it sounds like that some of the other colleagues have kind of mentioned, is the power struggle. Because as med students, we're kind of always being critiqued, and we're trying to make sure that we perform the best because we want to get the best, recommendation or evaluation on our rotation. And so, at those times we might not feel as comfortable to speak up. At least that's been my experience on certain situations. But luckily, like in our school, we have like an anonymous form evaluation to report whether or not someone's witnessed something that's gone down that was like unethical or racist or anything like that. And then in addition, we have our like mid clerkship evaluations with our program, like with like the specialty coordinator, specialty director. And usually at those times are when some of us have spoken up, at least during my internal medicine rotation, when I was always being kind of dismissed because I was female compared to my male colleague. I brought it up to the attention of my coordinator, and unfortunately that had been something that attending had issues with in previous years. So in addition to that, she was planning on trying to have a discussion with that person. And so those were kind of ways I was able to maneuver, at least speaking up, even though it was maybe not in that moment.
I wanted to kind of respond in terms of like kind of making changes, in response to like microaggression that can happen in your campuses or clinical setting. Is that I feel like from my experience, what I learned was that, when I had the incident happening in the clinic, I responded with my essay, added my voice, my personal experience, and I didn't feel like it was necessarily heard of. I felt like it was more of a complaint. And then I felt like, how can I add more power to my voice? And I felt like I started collecting or reaching out to, my peers who might be having similar experiences. And what happened was there was a council for diversity in education at our school. And so a bunch of my peers who all were experiencing microaggressions in their own ways kind of like joined this council. And, when we spoke our experiences all together in a pack of 5 or 6, people, I feel like our administration was more receptive, thankfully. And, they wanted now more data. So they wanted more anecdotal evidences of things that were happening. And so we kind of created a survey that could be anonymous, because I know that it could be really uncomfortable for a lot of people, like putting their names out just because of the bad evaluation that they might get or whatnot, because of the power differential. And so when people started kind of writing, a lot more responses came when it was anonymous. And I feel like, that survey was distributed, and when they saw that it was not just one person or 6 person, when there was like a handful of students going through, then they kind of saw it as like, there must be something systemically wrong here. And I know like some of the clinics that previous students had bad experiences are now no longer, participating with our school. And they also actually expanded the diversity and inclusion faculty, because there was only one faculty who was proactively reaching out to students, and now they added another dean towards that. And so I think the big component to my learning lesson was just that I feel like when I struggle, I feel like it's important to recognize that there could be many others who might be struggling. And so then how could we, form a community to kind of elevate and maximize those voices, so that we can, kind of present to whoever sits, up top there, and hold them accountable so that they can really do their job that they're getting paid for. And, as painful and as disheartening those experiences could have been for me and my peers, I'm hopeful that our school is being more receptive and wanting to bring change. I don't think so we are there yet, but at least they're listening to us, and hopefully more actions will follow in the coming days.
Thank you. And I think what some of the themes that I'm kind of hearing in terms of the response is really thinking about sort of culture and systems, right? Are there systems in place and structures in place to really allow for this to be addressed in a meaningful way and to mitigate the effects and hopefully prevent it? Are there safe spaces for people of color to come together to discuss and share their experiences and feel like they have a place to turn to during those times? And are there policies in place as well that support this? And I think that's really important. I know that there's been a lot of conversations that have been happening in many organizations, medical schools, residency programs, colleges throughout the nation in the last several weeks. I want to think about, do you guys have like examples of policies that have been changing in your own institutions, of groups that have gotten together, of safe spaces that are being created, of a response on a sort of a system or culture level as well to be able to support this work? Adrian, you may be saying something, but you're muted.
I don't know why I'm muted, because it looks like I'm not, but can you guys hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. Computer has been thwarting me all day, so it's like I'm going on strike or something. I don't know. So my friends and I had actually talked a lot during the first 2 years of our preclinicals about the number of microaggressions that were like woven in through the curriculum, especially in a lot of the like problem-based learning cases. And so an encouraging thing that happened was like we were able to, I worked with a professor who got like some changes have started coming about in my institution that made this possible. But so they appointed a new faculty dean of diversity, and then he showed some interest, and I was able to get connected with him, and we started developing a course for bias and microaggressions, an elective. But part of that elective wound up being that after students did the work to learn about it, then you develop a coding system, and we're like, and so now each iteration of this elective, people are going through the cases for specific blocks and rating them, and then having data as to the number of cases and what types of biases are identified, and then making suggested corrections. And then at the end of the elective, that cohort of students meets with the course management team of the respective course to kind of talk about it and explain what could change and what needs to change and stuff. So like we'll see if it actually does change and new curriculum rolls out, or I won't be here anymore by then. But it felt like something upstream
to do. So
yeah, at my school, our SNMA chapter put together a survey just to assess like how the cultural climate is, how students felt about diversity at the school, because we have been pushing, I go to Liberty, so it's not very diverse, and I'm the only Black female in my class. We have been pushing for the school to become, you know, more diverse and more inclusive for years. So with this recent survey, it's really interesting because it was actually on Juneteenth when the school sent out an email school-wide saying that they're actually now incorporating improved cultural competency curriculum. So they're going to include administration has agreed to incorporate implicit bias training for the school next year. They're forming a student faculty diversity committee. And like we've been pushing to we have no type of safe space for minority students at the school. So we didn't have an office of diversity and inclusion. So now they're going to incorporate that to the school. They're going to provide additional support for SNMA keynote events, which is great. And when I was involved at the school with SNMA, it's just like, compared to other organizations, I felt like we had to jump through a lot of hoops to kind of get the speakers we wanted and the events that we wanted to get done. And then they're incorporating more diversity celebration events. So it's really good to see that they're putting like, you know, actions in place that increase, you know, diversity and cultural competency. And so it's a step, you know, in the right direction. There's a long way to go, but it's kind of good to see these items in place.
At our institution, I go to PCOM Georgia. It's part of like the bigger branch of PCOM. And so the SNMA president-elect, national president-elect is actually at our Philadelphia campus. And what was really neat is that the entire campus, PCOM over 3 campuses, had a discourse over Zoom, had about 100 people in it. And it was sort of like discussions like this, but it was open to all faculty and all students. And I think the faculty enjoyed hearing, like it was enlightening for the faculty to hear the perspectives of the students, but it was also nice for the students to also hear each other's stories across different campuses. And as a result, they decided to have like a President's Diversity Council, which the SNMA student president now sits on. And something that we discussed was, as Victoria talked about, the training, diversity training. Something that my campus that is something my campus did not do well, in my opinion. Just because you can have something that says, all right, we do diversity training. I think there's a right way to do it, and I think there's a not great way to do it. So that's something that our school is looking into, is improving on to make sure that it's actually effective, as opposed to just crossing the T's and dotting the I on requirements.
Hi, everyone. This is something that my school, I go to Toro, California, has been trying to work on for several years. And really only since everything with George Floyd and beyond happened did we start to have some success. And it was through the National White Coats for Black Lives chapter. We're not an official chapter yet, but we joined the call that was maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, that called for national all medical students to publish a petition that you post and send to your medical students, calling for racial justice and equality within your school, calling for things like safe spaces like you were talking about, Victoria, for underrepresented minority students, looking at just objectively things like, are all the framed pictures at your school, do any of them have people of color, or of the people that are white, do any of them, are they openly, white supremacists or something like that? If so, take those down. Things like that you might not even think could really affect nobody, no sculpture or picture frame looks like me kind of thing. So since we published that petition, honestly, within 2 hours, we heard from the administration, and now there's a small group of maybe 5 or 6 students of color that meet with the administration on a bi-weekly basis to push an agenda that our larger Toro chapter, White Coats for Black Lives, discusses, and then those students bring forward to the administration. So I think the pressure of going public with something like a petition really helped move our goals forward in a way that we were not having success before.
Sounds like there's been a lot of movement, a lot of conversation, and a lot of action actually that's taken place in a short period of time, which is great. And I know that a lot of that has been driven by students, right? It hasn't necessarily come from always administrators or leaders within organizations, but sometimes it's coming from the bottom up to really sort of push and initiate change. And so I want to commend all of you who've been able to be a part of those efforts. And for some of you, the opportunity may have not presented itself, or maybe you're doing your own processing now, and you're not in a space to enter into that space yet, and that's perfectly fine as well. I did want to mention a couple of things regarding sort of like the microaggressions and frank racism as well that one might experience sort of in the workplace and in the clinical setting specifically. So I oftentimes get the question of like, well, what happens when a patient says something to me? What happens when it's not coming from a colleague or an attending, but it's coming from the person who I'm in the position now to partner with and serve, right, in their quest to be healthier? I will tell you what my approach is if somebody came into the room with me in the clinical space and raised a hand at me and slaps me across the face, I wouldn't tolerate it. If you're going to raise your figurative hand and slap me in the face emotionally, mentally, psychologically, I'm not going to tolerate that as well. I truly feel that you have the right to practice in a safe environment. And that safety is not just physical safety, it's your emotional and psychological safety as well. And hopefully there are routes, there are avenues in every place that you practice. And as you're looking for residency programs, ask this question as well. What happens if something like that happens? Who do I turn to? Who are the people who are going to advocate for me? Where are the safe spaces? What are the reporting mechanisms? Because I think that's really important to consider. A lot of this is the culture in place for this to not take place. And then the other thing I will say in terms of microaggressions is that, you know, sometimes you will have the wherewithal and the strength to respond or to say something. Sometimes you're just tired and you just don't have it in you to like say something in the moment. Give yourself some grace and some space for that as well. It is helpful to sort of practice what you're going to say in those moments if you are doing it sort of on behalf of somebody in sort of an allyship capacity. I think that is one of the most powerful ways that one can be an ally, is that when you see a microaggression happening to somebody else, instead of having them put in the position of having to then not only suffer the insult, but then correct the behavior, for somebody else to point out the insult is a super powerful thing to do. And that can happen in many ways. It can be in sort of posing the question of like, oh, when you said that, what did you mean by that? Right? There are many sort of ways of thinking about reframing the statement, like, oh, if it was your cousin or your family member that happens to, how would you feel about it? And I think that it's really important to kind of really practice that and think about when you guys are in the space in the not so distant future where you're in the position to actually create the culture, where you're in the position when you have a team of medical students and residents to set forth the expectations and rules. Remember that you have a power to create a situation where others behind you may not have to deal with the same things that you guys are dealing with on a daily basis. And now I want to be respectful of time. So it is 6:32. Dr. O'Connell, should we start wrapping up? Like, what? Give me my signal here, because I can talk with all of you fine people all day long.
Probably. I don't want to be directive at all. It almost sounds like we should do another one of these in the future and build on this. But we can take that offline and then bring it back out. So you're in charge here. Whatever you say. I would like to say a few words at the tail end, but
sure,
take it however you like.
Absolutely. Okay, so a couple of things. One is Dr. Aime has actually been able to join us. I think she's trying to log on now, so I do want to give her a moment just to introduce herself to the group. I put her on the spot. She's just come from the inpatient wards. And then the other thing is that you guys have shared a lot of great sort of solutions. Like the title of this session was How to Be an Anti-Racist. And as I said in the beginning, there's no like, you can't join an hour session and have all of the answers, right? This is a lifelong journey. But what we have done, because I do feel like there should always be a tangible takeaway, is come up with sort of a starter packet list of things that you can do. And we also have sort of a one-pager of sort of books and podcasts as well. So we will drop the books and podcast list into the Zoom chat. And then I will just share my screen momentarily so you can see the starter list that we came up with. And let's see if let me make sure that I do this correctly this time. Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think that's it. It's gonna actually change. Okay, well, I think you guys can see the slide, How to Be Anti-Racist Starter Packet, right? And so you guys have all been doing this work, and just by joining this session today, you're doing this work as well, right? In terms of sharing your experiences, listening to other people, becoming self-aware, I think is really important of your own biases, where they might lie, and then understanding sort of that historical, social, and political context. A lot of the formal education that we learn about American history and politics is really through sort of a Eurocentric lens, or the lens of white people's experience in this country. And so really expanding that knowledge base, identifying microaggressions and working on being able to address them, being open to feedback and change. Voting in your local elections is super important. Everyone is always focused on sort of the national elections, but your local city council, your mayor, they wield incredible power, particularly in certain communities. So really take advantage of exercising your right to vote locally and making some changes just in terms of some of the structures in your own community. Advocating for diversity in your workplace, in work groups that you have, in the leadership as well, right? Because the people who are sitting at the table making the decisions, if they are not reflective of a diverse group, it tends to limit the kinds of decisions that are made. And for some of you, this has been really important in the last several weeks, talking with family and friends. Really, sometimes the change begins with just speaking to people within your own circle. I've been talking to some friends who are like, I have not been able to do anything outside of literally just trying to have a conversation with my obstinate uncle for the last several weeks. And that's okay. Like, good for you for like taking on that mantle. And it can sometimes be more challenging having critical conversations with the people closest to you than with a stranger. That's really important. Creating diversity within your inner circles. Who are your friends and your family? Who are you surrounded by? Who are the people who are part of your circles? Please don't go out and just ask like Black people to be your friend right now because you need Black people as friends. But like when you are thinking about the things that you enjoy doing, the places that you want to kind of go to, just be sort of diverse in terms of thinking about the ways that you're exploring the world, the entertainment that you're consuming, et cetera. And you will naturally come across people of different backgrounds and colors to hopefully call your friends. And then of course, challenging stereotypes. And this is particularly important in medicine, where we have a lot of tropes in medicine that we sort of use as ways of identifying certain like key words that we will use to know like, oh, this is the answer for the board question, right? And so that's some of the issues that are problematic in the medical culture. And I know there's a lot of work really looking at right now the difference between race in medicine versus racism in medicine. Race, a social construct, should not affect things. Racism, however, does have the effect. And so really teasing that out is important as well. Like I said, this is a starting list. This is not everything. I will stop sharing now so that I can see everybody again. And I will drop in sort of that one-pager list into the chat functionality as well. But if there are any sort of last comments, I think Dr. Yay! Okay, she's borrowing Dr. Walker's computer so she can say a quick word to the group while I drop in that last.
Can't hear you, Aime.
Hi everyone, my name is Aime Castillo. I am one of the third-year residents here at Kaiser Vallejo or Kaiser Napa-Solano. I'm really sorry that I got to miss a really good discussion, but I know that you probably had great conversations with Dr. Stecker, and she's awesome. I'm sure you've all had an opportunity to learn from her, and I'm definitely happy for you, if you guys want to reach out to me. I know that Dr. Stecker can probably provide my contact information. But you can definitely count me as an ally and as a supporter. And if you guys have any kind of thoughts or anything and want to kind of hear my own perspective on kind of how I'm dealing with all of these issues and in my own kind of experience, feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Thank you, Aime. So I just want to thank Dr. Tessa Stecker, Dr. Jaquay Walker, and Dr. Aime Castillo-Mazzantini for putting together this session and moderating it. Brilliant as usual. I also would like to thank all of you medical students as well as the residents and attendings that joined us for your participation in and engagement with this session. Your involvement and comments really help with the discourse and moving us forward as a group and as a society. So thank you for joining us in this session and really being part of it. For those of you who are participating in the AAFP Virtual National Conference, we hope to see you at the booth tomorrow. Like we did today, if there are issues with the booth, we will pivot to Zoom and we'll put a link there so that we can join. And we were doing it as a group and want to try to find a way to do it individually as well. So we're going to do some work in the background to try to figure that out. But we're really just happy to have the opportunity to engage with all of you and have this discussion. So with that, I will hand it to Dr. Jaquay Walker and Dr. Tessa Stecker to wrap us up.
Well, thank you once again, everybody. I know we could have continued this conversation for a lot longer. And thank you, everyone. Also, we didn't get to sort of share with everybody what was happening in the chat. There were lots of additional great comments and stories and experiences that people were putting in there. So we really thank you for that. And hopefully everyone's had a chance to kind of follow along, even though we couldn't quite keep up with it. It was so vigorous. But truly, thank you everyone for taking the time this evening to really join us. You could be doing a lot of things right now, and including checking out what's new on Netflix. And you chose to take some time to really have an open and thoughtful discussion, and we really, truly appreciate it. Please know that we are always available if you have additional questions, comments. We're happy to host additional sessions as well. There are so many topics, there are so many facets that we weren't able to get to today, but please continue doing your own self-exploration, learning, and self-care. Self-care is very important. This work can be quite exhausting. It can take a lot out of you, and it can feel demoralizing sometimes. So have those things that really bring you joy and that help you take care of yourself in this marathon of work.
And the final thing to say is I see comments about being involved in other sessions. If you would like to be involved in other sessions and are not on our invite list, you can email, you'll see the email address on the front of our booth for the conference, but gilbert.garces, Garces, @kp.org. Gilbert is one of our residency staff members and is maintaining our email distribution list. So if you're not on the list and would like to be, please feel free to reach out. All right, everyone. I wish you a good evening, and we'll see some or most of you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening.